they're super cool because they're superheroes, really, right? I mean, they're, the way that we've created secret agents and spies. I think of things like recent things like, Black Widow, right? Or even the James Bond legacies. I mean, these are people with superhuman abilities, but they're actually cast and presented as human.
All right, welcome everyone to another author chat here on SFFaddicts. And I'm very pleased today to be chatting with a friend of mine, Jonathan Nevair. He's an art historian, a professor, and the self-published author of the Wind Tide Trilogy, including Goodbye to the Sun, Jati's Wager, and No Song But Silence. And his newest release is Stellar Instinct, a Sci-Fi space adventure which came out on December 1st. He's also a ray of positive light in the SFF community, and I'm so glad we finally get the chance to talk to each other, buddy. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Oh man, it's my pleasure. Before we delve deeper, I just want to congratulate you on the release of Stellar Instinct. How are you feeling about getting this new book out there?
I'm super excited. I was really excited to have a standalone after writing the 3-book series. And it's fun, it's fast, it's a little more action based. And so it's a nice shift and a nice change in tone for me. And I'm really excited to see how it goes.
Oh, dude, well, I'm glad we get the chance to talk about it. But first, tell me a bit more about your relationship with sci-fi and fantasy and reading, and how did you get into this wonderful world that we now inhabit?
Sure. So I grew up, I would say my earliest interests were really in more of a standard action adventure genre,
Mm,
and that kind of bled into more of the fantasy. And I was definitely a strong fantasy reader before I was a science fiction reader and a science fiction fan.
mhm.
But I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so I grew up with a lot of classic 80s sci-fi thrillers, and those were always there, and I was always consuming them as well. But I really was very fantasy driven for a long time in a lot of my reading and entertainment, and it was only in my late 30s when I was starting to commute on the train to work that I really started to really read science fiction strongly. And sort of started out in the usual places with the usual classic subjects, but very quickly bumped up to the present and just started devouring stuff. And I think it just eventually got under my skin to the point where it was like, my imagination and my own desire to create a world that was in outer space in a secondary universe just got the better of me, and I ended up doing it and loved it. And from there, it was just full steam ahead.
Dude, I love that. We'll elaborate on that in a second, but what was it about the commute? How long was this commute, and what was it about
Yeah.
that sparked you to read science fiction, whereas you've been mostly fantasy beforehand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the commute came because I shifted from living in Philly to moving out a little bit to the suburbs on to kind of an
Mhm.
edge of rural. So I had about a good 40 minutes on the train.
Okay.
And if I wasn't grading or doing something like that, I was going to read. And I decided to myself, I'm going to just use this time to read. And so it was an opportunity to have this, like, I can't go anywhere. I'm just going to sit and read because there's so many distractions for me otherwise. And so it became
Mhm.
this wonderful chunk of time. Why I got into the sci-fi at that moment, I really don't know. I'm not sure what it was, but I ended up, I think the first thing I read was with Rama. I think was the
Nice.
first thing I read. And shortly thereafter went into like Old Man's War. I had read Dune, but went into like Old Man's War and some of the Scalzi stuff. And then from there, you're just moving and fanning outward in the Delta up to the present. But yeah, I had a good 45 minutes in both directions. So I was able to get some pretty good reading done.
Solid.
Uh, yeah.
Nice, man. And you mentioned that it was this that kind of sparked your desire to start writing on your own. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, and
Yeah.
how that stuff that you were reading was like
Yeah.
convincing enough to think, fuck man, I gotta put pen to page and
Yeah.
create my own stuff.
Yeah, I had a friend. I think I might have told you this once before. I had a friend who wrote a novel. He wrote a YA fantasy
Hmm.
sort of portal fantasy, and he asked me to beta read it at the time, and I beta read it, and I'm one of those people that I'm definitely one of these people. My wife could attest to this. Like when I see something that interests me, I'm not comfortable passively consuming it. I want to do it. So
Mm.
like I have all these rando things I've done in my life. Like it was like I heard someone play cello in the park walking home from work. And it was like, I want to play cello. So then I'm like learning how to play cello for like 2 months until finally my wife is like, you need to stop trying to learn to play cello because this is absolutely terrible. But that's kind of my personality. And, I read this YA book and I was like, I want to do this. I want to do this. This is really interesting. And when we had the conversations and I gave him some feedback, I realized this is like super cool. I really like this and I want to give it a go. And
Hmm.
that was the initial bump. And, I wrote a novel that was a very cliche, very tropey, post-apocalyptic, right? Just like most people, a lot of people do. And, that was a novel that taught me how to write a novel. I
Mm.
saw Anthony Ryan actually today tweeted out something about the fact that like the best way to learn how to write a novel is to write a novel is to write a novel.
Hmm.
And I definitely agree. Like I got my literary sea legs doing that novel. And then I was in at that point. I loved it. And I really wanted to just run with it.
Oh, that's awesome. I think Jenny Dewis also wrote a post-apocalyptic novel before she ended up writing The Last Watch. So I think that's yeah, I think that's funny. But obviously it's like you gotta play around with those tropes and stuff like that in
Yeah.
order to figure out what really clicks with you, but also to be able to learn how to play with tropes to your advantage or subvert them to your advantage as well. So I think that's really useful. But in your case, at the same time, it's like you teach, you're a professor and an art historian. How has that fiction side of things grown alongside your career as a professor and an art
Yeah.
historian? And how did your experience publishing academically
Yeah.
translate to thinking about things like self-publishing and
Yeah.
writing?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One of them is the kind of the standard and obvious answer is that when I'm doing the art history writing, there's a certain amount of subjectivity in artistic interpretation, which
Hmm.
is always there. But generally speaking, when you're doing something art historical, you really are relying on evidence based methodology. So it's like, right, you're setting out to prove a thesis and you're providing the evidence to do that. I think it really helps me with research before I write. I'm just used to the mechanics of research, right? And the process
Yeah.
of then synthesizing and putting things together. And that comes fairly easy. And I think that's really helpful. I also think that articulating in world building, I think articulating sensory and visual specific information is something that I'm very comfortable with because I teach all the time, right? And I'm always talking about visual imagery and having to transcribe it right through language. So for me, that I think was a real interesting benefit that was a crossover for sure. Um, and the other, but the liberating part of fiction was I was free from the evidence based methodology, and it was just like such a weight off of me to be able to have the freedom and the creativity to just sort of go where I wanted to go with my imagination
Right.
and not have to worry about if I lost the chain of the link to the evidence, because if that happens then you can't publish that particular piece, right? I mean, you either have to keep searching for the piece of evidence you need and going to the archives to find it, or you have to just give up on that if you can't make that thesis work. So the fiction was
Right.
wonderful for that. And then the other thing that I just realized in the last week or so, just reflecting on this, was there's so much balance between form and content when you're talking about visual works of art. And so I think also that for me, I'm thinking a lot in terms of the relationship of form and content as a writer. And I'm thinking about, how are you expressing something, right, through, let's say, the mark and the gesture on canvas, right? What is it about the way you're doing that? Are you doing it very clean and very tight, or are you doing it very loose and very painterly, right? Are you letting the colors and the mark making be an expressive part of the image? And I think in language, I think you can do a lot of the same things, and I'm always really interested in that. So when I'm doing like work reading, because I also do that. I have like pleasure reading and then I have close reading where I'm reading as a writer, right?
Yeah.
And like watching and looking at how people do stuff. And I think that there's people who are amazing at doing that tight, clean, lean, precise method, and there's
Hmm.
people who are really wonderful, right, at that very, embellished and flourished rhythmic cadence, formal language, just as up at the front as the content that you're getting from the reading.
Hmm.
And I think that that's something that, as an art historian, I also am really thinking about a lot.
That's really cool because yeah, it's like you know, Ernest Hemingway and his very sparse but
Right.
tight prose versus someone like Virginia Woolf who's has a lot more flourish, but it's very purposeful. And it's really cool how you have this like spectrum of language in the same way that you have spectrum of artistic expression. And that's something that is so cool that you're able to kind of like connect these two worlds of your sort of like professional passions and interlinking them in this really fascinating way.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think about someone like Martha Wells writing Murderbot, and then Arkady
Mhm.
Martine writing like a memory called Empire. It's like those to
Yeah.
me represent very different, right? But they're both amazing, and they're both using language in these amazing ways. Yeah, and yeah, the crossovers are really interesting. Everyone always asks me, Adrian, this is the thing I get, right, all the time. It's like, oh, you're going to write a Da Vinci Code? And like, oh, yeah, because you're an art historian. This is like the problem with being an art historian. Everyone wants to talk about Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
Um, but actually, Dan Brown was ironically very helpful in his masterclass on thrillers, for me personally. But
Agreed. Yeah.
so,
I I'm also a big fan, even though it's like I'm not necessarily a big fan of his work. I
yeah,
appreciate the the craft that went into them, and I also watched his masterclass on thrillers and
yeah,
all the master classes from writers are super
yeah,
useful.
they're
I
so
find
great.
even if it's not like oh I'm a massive fan of their work, you
Yeah,
know,
it's
but at the same
fascinating.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
fascinating and you can definitely pull a bunch of tidbits from there.
yep,
And I'm curious, after this post-apocalyptic book that you wrote, kind of
yeah.
shaking off your sea legs a little bit, what were your initial inspirations for what would become Goodbye to the
Mm,
Sun, and then eventually expanding that into the 3 books of the
yeah.
Wind Tide trilogy?
Yeah, so, what happened was an agent had told me, had read it and had told me that they really liked my writing, they really liked my world building, but they just didn't connect with the characters. And I'm in a position where I'm like, thank God that that manuscript didn't go out, because
Hmm.
now I look back on it and I see that I would have been very unhappy had it gone out. But that got me thinking, and so I did a lot of research. I looked up, like, how do you engage, how do you create more engaging characters? How do you create more character driven writing? How do you create empathy with your readers, with your characters? And then I sat down and I looked at different subgenres, and I looked at, where can I go to find stories, narrative structures and stories that have extremely strong characters present, and arcs. And that was my way of overcompensating, right, for the
Hmm.
criticism. And I ended up in tragedy, and in particular in Greek tragedy. I mean, that's a great example. If you want emotion, and you want to take a really heavy character arc journey, that would work. And so I ended up there. And from there, it was kind of like Antigone just spoke to me, for a couple of reasons. I really liked the theme of family versus state, which I thought was a really good one, because I'm very interested in ethics. And I liked a lot of the issues around gender that had to do with different characters in Antigone as well, which I
Right.
thought was interesting. And then from there, it was like, I guess from that point, it sort of just took off on its own. I think I had reread Dune, and so I had Dune on my mind, which helped obviously with the way in which I created in kind of an arid world as one of the two
Yeah.
settings. And inner monologue, I would say, is the other thing about Dune for me and Herbert is, I like inner monologue a lot.
Hmm.
But yeah, and from there, Razor just appeared on the page, and it was an epistolary sort of a opening, and then Keane appeared second, and I had this weird setup which I modeled off of the Greek tragedy, where it was the actors and then the chorus speaking, and I
Hmm.
liked that kind of POV fluctuation, and that's where it started.
Oh
Yeah.
man, very cool. I like how Dune was kind of this like because reading Goodbye to the Sun, especially, it's like you get such of this like space fantasy vibe,
Hmm.
but just like the epicness and the scope of it. But then you also have the historical influences of something like
Right.
Greek tragedy and
Right.
Antigone. Why do you think that this kind of setting, this far future space opera type setting, is such a good foil for exploring themes like language, and you mentioned
Mm.
ethics, but also things like technology and history and gender and all
Yeah.
that?
I mean, it's one of those things where for me a secondary world, I like a secondary world because number one, I like to be separated from having to make the link back to the primary world, even if it's a far future space opera. I don't like to have it in any way connected to Earth history. That's
Right.
just me personally. Um, First of all, I don't want to explain how we got there. To me, that just feels like a
Just
heavy burden.
wasted
It's
space.
super interesting when other authors do it, and I really
Yeah.
enjoy it. But for me, it's a burden. But um, you know, being in that secondary world gives me the liberty to reimagine, right, and reconfigure socioeconomic structures, philosophical influences on how societies are built and ideology. Um, and again, it gives you the ability to play with language because you can just break the way in which things are done in our world, and you don't need to then point to the evolution that got it to that stage.
Mm,
It just is this way in that other world. I really like that. So with gender in that series, and it's something that I really felt strongly about. This is just the way it is there,
mhm.
and it wasn't an issue. This is how society has developed. They accept gender in this way, and this is how it functions.
Yeah. And at the same time, it's like your world, obviously there's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of trauma and different things that are going on,
Yeah.
but I feel that the Wind Tide trilogy ultimately is very hopeful. Um, and I'm curious from
Yay.
your
Hope.
perspective. Yeah, man. Why is it so important from your perspective, especially these days, for science
Yeah.
fiction to be hopeful and offer inspiration to readers, compared to
Yeah.
everything that we're dealing with in everyday life?
You know, uh, yeah, I'm so glad you pointed that out too, by the way, because it takes a long time to get to the hope in that series.
Mhm.
But you do get there. Um, and for me, a lot of it has to do with pointing out or trying to convey to I guess, to readers through the experience of that world that oftentimes it isn't the people. It is the people, but it's also the structures
Yeah.
for me. And making it clear that the structures of thought, the structures of politics, the structures of economics, right? That these are factors that hold us back from doing what we really want to do and what we know is right. And so when you can write something that takes you through that entire arc and journey, but you get to the point where you can dismantle and then have the opportunity to rebuild at the end. I love that because that is a message that's really important to me. And I like the message. I like the message after it comes with some tragedy. It's kind of like a eucatastrophe, I think is the word Tolkien used for that. But it's like, this euphoric catastrophe. And it's like, I really, I just really am drawn to that. So like Rogue One,
Yes.
these types of stories really are powerful for me, and I like that, and I think that it's wonderful to see us getting to a point where there's so much writing that's happening that is really now falling under this category of hope punk, because for such a long time I think there has been a lot of writing that has a kind of dystopia kind of a tone to it.
Mhm.
And it's nice to see a resurgence of that. And I think it's something that has always been around and is there, and was even more maybe so back when people like Ursula Le Guin was writing, and people like that as well. That there was this idea like you could use science fiction to make echoes back to what you wanted to see happen in our world.
Mhm.
Yeah,
It's like the conversation that we're having between fiction and reality, and
yeah,
there's a lot of potency there, and I think it's really cool that you were able to. I love that you brought up Tolkien's sort of approach of like eucatastrophe, because it's
yeah,
like stories, um they've a lot of it really hinges on the characters and what you're bringing up earlier. It's like you wanted to explore how to do character better, and tragedy was what you initially went with in Goodbye to the Sun.
Yeah.
But to have you catastrophe, where it's like there is catastrophe, there is tension, there is difficulty and struggle for these characters, but in the end, it gets to a point where it is hopeful, or there is some glimmer of potential hope out there, which I think is really
Yeah.
important for people to read. And, for you going through that trilogy, how did you see your approach to things like character and
Mm,
world building
yeah.
develop and sort of progress over the course of those books?
I'm laughing to myself because I've been telling myself for 3 years, 2 years now, probably wasn't a great idea to start the first book with a tragedy. Um, First of all, to like pull readers in, I don't know that that was such a good idea too, because it's such a tragic thing, and
Hmm.
obviously there's loss. um, yeah, it was interesting because I kind of had to do that first book as and I've told you this before, I think, I had to market that book as a standalone with series potential, which is kind of
Hmm.
standard for the market.
Yeah.
So there needed to be closure there. Especially with a tragedy, there is this way in which, people do the right thing, but they only do it after it's too late for them to save themselves. I mean, that's kind of like standard. And so I had to really think about that. And the way that I handled it was secondary characters from the first book ended up becoming and rising into the narrative as main characters as I moved forward. And that
Hmm.
was really fun to do. And it became this kind of motif that I played on. So, Ilo, who is the main character of Johnny's Wager, the second book, starts out with a little cameo at this downtrodden, really dreary moon base, asking for a coin, from the main character, and
Yeah.
becomes the main character along with Johnny in book two. And then Laszlo, this little kid who has this brief cameo in two, ends up becoming the main character pairing with Ilo in book three. And it involved time jumps, and that was the one obstacle for me, was
Yeah.
the time jumps, because they were fairly significant, and I had to have a chart, literally, of people's ages, and I had to sit down with a calculator because I wanted it to be 30 years, and I couldn't do it because if it was 30 years, three people were going to be 108, and I
Yeah.
had to and I literally had to be confined a little bit by the timeline and what I could do and what I couldn't do to get that
MJ
three book arc. Yeah.
MJ Kuhn would be so proud of you for doing all that on an Excel spreadsheet.
But I didn't use Excel. So, like, right. I mean, I literally had like scraps of paper all over the room. I need MJ's Excel for sure. Yeah. It was interesting. But yeah, so, it kind of became an anthology series. I mean, I think that's what it
Hmm.
really is. At least book one and book two are autonomous, right? They can be read autonomously. Three, I think if you start with two, you can do three and go back to one, or you can
Hmm.
go one, two, three.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. What are some other big lessons and takeaways that you took from the process of writing these three books, and now, you know, moving on and working on
Yeah.
another one?
Jeez, I don't know. This is always like such a hard question. I learned, I know what I learned. I learned that even though I don't plot and plan everything, that I should know what the ending is or
Hmm.
have a general idea of the ending. I have a tendency to, even if I know or think I know what the ending is, I have a tendency to rock and roll all the way from Act One through all of Act Two, and then the writing breaks, screech to a halt at the beginning of Act Three, and I
Hmm.
usually have a month of torturous, just stasis where I'm literally just stuck,
Yeah.
and that's terrible. And I try to avoid that and as much as possible. So I think I learned that I have to kind of at least have an exit ramp that's down towards the end of the road.
Hmm.
That's something that I think is really helpful. I think I also learned a lot about overwriting. The more I write, the more I've learned about overwriting and
Hmm.
trying to cut back and find that balance. Yeah, I
Nice.
don't know. Yeah, it's
Those are good
hard.
lessons, though. But building on that, let's get into Stellar Instinct. With those Wind Tide lessons in mind, with
Yeah.
everything that you've learned over the course of those books, what was your thought process going into this new one?
So I wanted to write something fun and light because the Wind Tide series is heavy,
Hmm.
and it was heavy on me. I mean, because of the characters are so there's a lot of emotional weight there, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
difficulty and a lot of ethical rigor. And the tone, I think, is, it's action based, but there is a lot of philosophy in there. And I wanted a break, and I wanted to do something lighter, and I wanted to challenge myself a little bit too. So I thought, let me see if I can move to another subgenre a little bit, or hybrid, but create a hybrid. And so I've always wanted to write a spy novel. I have been into spies and secret agents since I was a little kid. And so this was always in the back of my mind, like, I want to do a spy secret agent in space, because I really couldn't find many.
Hmm.
And I thought the potential was just so interesting, because out of the primary world, there's so much you could do, which could be so interesting. And so that was really the driving factor, was I wanted to do something fast, fun, and a standalone.
Yeah, because I'm trying to think of it too. It's like you just mentioned that there's not this broad array of like spy novels set
Yeah.
in space or anything. Like the one that comes to mind is actually a French comic called Valerian. I don't know if you've seen that, if you've read that, but there was also like an adaptation movie that was pretty
Hmm.
lackluster. And for me, it was like, oh man, that's such a bummer because the source
Yeah.
material is great. It has so
Yeah.
much humor, but the movie was
Yeah.
just kind of like, whatever. But other than that, I'm trying to rack my brain, but
Yeah.
I
I mean,
can't
Dan
really
Moran
come up with
has
much.
like the Byron Agenda, and that series. There is a series there, but there
Hmm.
really aren't too many.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like fertile territory in a way to jump into. And I had just been watching, I think, the Cowboy Bebop on Netflix.
Nice.
Actually, per Jenny's recommendation from that time on the
Right
podcast,
on.
and that was kind of in my head too. So I was kind of just in that vibe, that kind of like galaxy spanning, sort of action, fun, sort of mood and tone, and I think that helped me out a lot.
A lot of cheeky humor as well.
Yeah, some cheeky humor. I had watched this might come up later, but Downton Abbey, believe it or not,
Wow.
also was an influence on Stellar Instinct. Yeah, weird,
How?
but
No, no,
so
elaborate, man. Come on.
so Granny Kissy, the
Yeah.
character of Granny Kissy is modeled off of Violet Crawley from Downton Abbey, who
Hmm.
is Maggie Smith's role in Downton Abbey. I was actually pretty. I had just watched, I think, the Christmas special, the latest final film, right around the time I think I started to plot and plan. And I was really taken by the relationship, believe it or not, of Mary and Violet Crawley in that last movie. I thought it was really endearing.
Hmm.
And they're both, I loved both their characters in that show. They're both super, like, interesting, strong willed, cunning, in their own way.
Hmm.
And I really liked that tone between the grandmother and the granddaughter. And I think that got in my head.
That's fantastic, man. Well,
Maggie Smith
I'm
in space, right?
Maggie Smith is face. Yeah,
That's a
fuck,
series right there.
fuck all the comps that you've done so far. Just Maggie Smith in
Just
space.
Maggie Smith in space. That's all you need to know.
Oh, that's great. So when you're you mentioned a lot of the inspiration and stuff, but
Yeah.
how did you actually come up with the different aspects of this new universe as well as the main character?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm saying her name, Lillian
Lillian,
Renault.
yeah.
Yeah,
Lillian
perfect.
Renault. Yep. Yeah. Well, I kind of got a challenge. A couple of reviewers had actually said something about the Wind Tide, that it was a human only universe. And it
Hmm.
kind of stuck with me. And I was like, yeah, it is. And I'd had a couple conversations with people about this. And I just always think of the world that I imagine as a kind of human only universe. And I had talked with another writer who runs a great indie bookshop, Jean Paul Garnier. And we had talked a little bit about it. And he was like, I'm gonna challenge you to write some multi-species in your next book. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna try it. And so that was like an impetus for me to kind of generate some broader diversity, I guess, in sort of sentient species
Hmm.
in the world itself. Yeah. And I mean, the other part of it was, I have such an inventory, I have to say, of tropes from all of the movies and the books that it came so easy. All I needed to really do was educate myself on thrillers because I really needed to learn a lot. I needed to learn about the beats. And, because I think in a thriller, readers expect certain beats to happen in a thriller, and you kind of have to have them for the thriller to be a thriller. And so I needed to learn those. And so, that took a little bit of time, but the specific niche of the espionage spy thriller, that was easy. It was easy. And like we talked about earlier with the secondary world, the freedom to think about, everything from the gadgets to the ways that I could have people, interacting, based off of kind of a spy narrative, that part came really easy.
Yeah, I can imagine. And for Lillian as a titular character, I know myself why spies are so fucking cool, but just I want to hear you
Yeah.
explain to me why you think like spies and secret agents are
Yeah.
so compelling as
Yeah.
characters.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're super cool because they're superheroes, really, right? I mean, they're the way that we've created secret agents and spies. I think of things like recent things like Black Widow, right? Or even the James Bond legacies. I mean, these are people with superhuman abilities, but they're actually cast and presented as human. And whether it's their knowledge of fine wines, right, where James Bond can sniff the brandy and tell it has an overdose of bon noir, like, I mean, like, all these kinds of, I mean, those, I always ate that stuff up,
Yeah,
so there's something just really cool about being the secret agent, and the travel, the luxury, and all of those kinds of elements to me are just so fun. And I think I lean even more towards that than the more of the intrigue side. So like, like the spy who
right.
came in from the cold, right? Like the Licari stuff, like that's great. And it's wonderfully done, but that's so, it's very intimate, it's like,
Yes.
you're talking about like small clues, subtle details, people speaking and saying something else, then meaning something else, testing somebody by their rhetoric, like that's a whole cool thing unto itself. But for me, I kind of like the spectacle. Like I'm
Mhm.
more into the like, ski off the cliff, pull the parachute, right? Drop in the water, drive the White Lotus into the ocean and turn it into a submarine. Um, I always liked that kind of stuff a lot.
Me too. Me too. And you brought him up already, and that those perfect references. We spoke about James Bond on Twitter,
Yeah,
um, and you used it as I don't think you used it as a comp, but it's definitely like very evident
yeah,
in reading Stellar Instinct the influence of something like James Bond. Um, Tell me about your relationship with that series, and what are some of the major elements that you love about it?
yeah,
Including
yeah,
we said about like the spectacle and that
yeah,
kind of stuff.
sure. So I don't like to use the comp because there are problems with James Bond, right? I mean, like
True.
there's sexism, misogyny, colonialist issues in the Fleming books, right? And they get into the movies too.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of things there to be aware of. But I grew up on that stuff, and I absolutely loved it growing up. And eh, I mean, there's a kind of a there's a kind of a standard plate, right, in every Bond movie, and it kind of
Hmm.
has all of these things that you see over and over again. The gadgets, right? It's like you always get the gadgets. Um, you always get you always get the kind of the criminal the monologue, right? You get the villain monologue, which is
Hmm.
is always such a wonderful moment. And I always loved the way that it was the individual pitted against the individual in the
Hmm.
bonds. Like I really like that. Like usually, if the cavalry got called, the cavalry was late. Right?
Yeah.
It was like Bond had already done what had to be done by the
Or it
time the
was like
cavalry got there.
it was almost like a humorous touch, like, oh shit,
Yes,
Like
right.
Felix Leiter's here now.
Right. Here comes
Where
Leiter
was
with
it?
with the Navy, right? It's like, oh, and he's already floating on the raft having champagne, right? It's like,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, and I have to say that, I definitely was inspired. Like I personally, I like my favorite James Bond movie is From Russia with Love. My favorite Ian Fleming book is From Russia with Love. Um,
Hmm.
I really am drawn. You asked me this to come back around to the question. I'm drawn to secret organizations like Spectre, and I love
Yeah.
these sort of secret organizations that are doing behind the scenes things. But that one is the most realistic, I think, and the most visceral.
Hmm.
And so I really like it. But I will tell you that in Stellar Instinct, a lot of my childhood in the 1970s was really at the front of my mind. So things like The Spy Who Loved Me, For Your Eyes Only,
Hmm.
Moonraker, these kinds of mid 70s where it gets just a little bit campy,
The goofier
right?
era of Bond. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And where I think some of the gadgets and some of the acrobatics and feats are maybe even a little bit over the top.
Hmm.
Um, but but yeah, all of that stuff was food for there. So I have a really strong relationship with it. I have all the books on my shelf. I mean, I read all the books, saw the films, and some of the new ones I think are really good too.
Yeah.
Skyfall
I
I think is really good.
Yeah, you and I grew up in different eras. Mine was like the 90s Pierce
Pierce
Brosnan era.
Brosnan, okay,
But my oldest brother is a massive James Bond fan. So we had all of the movies on VHS.
okay,
And going back, I remember like getting older. It's like GoldenEye was just so it just left such a strong impression on my head, you
hmm
know? And Sean Bean as the villain and all this
yes,
different kind of
yes,
stuff. Like
yes,
it was like, oh man, like the spectacle that you were mentioning was
yep,
incredible. But then going back and watching them later on, I think the two that really stood out to me were very different eras, but like
yep,
Timothy Dalton in The
hmm
Living Daylights.
Living
And
Daylights.
then I'm glad that you brought up From Russia with Love because I really enjoy that one as well.
Oh
So it's kind
yeah,
of like it's cool to see the progression of a character over the course of these different eras and different actors.
yeah,
And for you to be able to do something like Stellar Instinct, where you can have a conversation through your own work
yeah.
about this stuff that was so influential to you over the course of your life.
Yeah. I mean, it was really fun. I just have to say it was really, really fun to write. It was fun. It was easy. And I was definitely I made some Easter egg nods at times, I think,
Mhm.
to some of it. But some of it just, I think now has become, they're tropes. I mean, they're just kind of Bond tropes, right? I mean, they're
Yeah.
just out there now. I mean, if you look at Austin Powers movies, I mean, that's a lesson if you want to learn about tropes, right? And just watch
Mhm.
the Austin Powers movies because they're just plain to see.
Yeah, it's like trope for the purpose of satire, and it
Yeah,
works
yeah,
beautifully.
and it works
Yeah.
beautifully. Yeah.
Awesome. And there are a couple things that I wanted to touch on from the book, in terms of sort of like writing craft, but also
Mhm.
themes. You We brought up Bond, and of course we have to talk about villains. What, from your perspective, makes a truly compelling villain, and why is it important
Mm.
for this kind of action thriller to actually give the villain sufficient page time, but not too
Yeah.
much page time? It's like finding that right balance.
Yeah. I think for a narrative like this sort of secret agent adventure, it's a particular kind of a villain, right? You need a villain who has um, goals and desires that are out of balance with what is acceptable, both let's say politically as well as morally, right?
Hmm.
And so you need that. You need someone who's overreaching, where and that's going to give you your kind of your world domination, right, or galaxy domination sort of agenda on the part of the villain. But I think you need that. I think you can't have someone who's just out to take out somebody or do something to take control of something. It needs to be bigger, I think, in this case. And I think also they have to have a fatal flaw, and
Hmm.
that fatal flaw needs to be their strength, I think, and the thing that makes them fearful until it turns around on them. And so I think in this case, a temper was kind of mixed with control issues,
Hmm.
as a means to, I think, create that villain. In terms of page time, that was tough, because it was like,
Yeah.
at what point too you have to make a decision when you write the thrillers too. Like, am I going to tell you who the villain is, right? Or am I not going to tell you? And in this case, um, so because of that, you have to create other obstacles and other forms of suspense because you already know who the opposition is.
Hmm.
The main character might not, but you as the reader do. And so, yeah, I tried to drop that in there just enough to keep us mindful. This is what's going on over here. This is this person's agenda. This is
Hmm.
what's happening on this side, even though we're following the thread of clues really through the main plot line.
Yeah, for sure. And then you brought up this kind of strength flaw dynamic of the villain's temper, but also his control issues. And I think
Hmm.
that plays really nicely with something that becomes a very overarching sort of fabric of the book, which is virtual and augmented
Yeah,
reality. So how did you kind of bring those threads
yeah.
together in an exciting way?
Actually, before I answer that, I just wanted to mention too that I also thought about that same flaw issue with Laline. I thought
Hmm.
that I just want to say one of the problems I find with a lot of the characters, like the Bonds or the other ones, are that they're a flat character arc, right? They're like they already have all their powers and
Yeah.
abilities, so you just got to put obstacles in front of them. And I wanted Laline to have a subplot which would involve an area where she doesn't have a lot of talent and skill, and so that was where the
Hmm.
poetry part came in. It's like she's a
Yeah.
great secret agent, but she sucks at poetry. Um,
But she wants
because
to be
I
good.
she wants to be good, but that's a nice way I think of kind of creating a two-layered moving arc, which was nice.
Hmm.
But yeah, with the virtual, I think again, it's like how it is you're just doing things in your life, right? And like things happen to you, and then they make their way into your books. So my
Hmm.
brother had bought me an Oculus Quest, which is the virtual reality gaming system,
Yep.
about just maybe like a year, 2 years ago, and so I'd been playing Vader Immortal, and I'd been taking trips right to like Victoria Falls on virtual reality and just getting into this incredible space, which is really just unbelievable. And I'd been teaching it a little bit with the students in the theory class and talking about cyberspace and virtual space and the way that it can be a liberating space, but it can also become a new space of power and oppression and control and
Yep.
regulation. And so that was on my mind, I think. And when the egregore, this entity idea came up, when I thought about it being in an extra dimensional space and coming out of a larger cosmic order,
Hmm.
I had the idea of mixing together the idea of our limited perception of reality as a kind of a sensory physical world, but this other space exists in the virtual. And I thought this is a really cool thing to tap because I wanted the villain to be I wanted the villain to be a entrepreneur. Um, Probably because of current events and stuff, which has
Yeah.
maybe been exacerbated recently, but was only simmering a little less maybe when I did this. But so that's where that came from. And I liked the idea of trying to write a virtual reality,
Hmm.
which I thought was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And at the same time, it's like you have to balance all of this in terms of pacing. And I think pacing is one of those
Yeah,
things. Obviously, we brought up your sort of difficulties to figuring out like how much page time do I give to the villain,
yeah,
but also at the same time, it's like how much page time do you give to character development versus
yeah,
something like action, and how do you control that? So, what was
yeah,
it like for you in terms of controlling that pacing
yeah.
throughout this story?
I learned so much writing this thriller. I can't tell you really. I feel like I learned so much. Enter a scene later, leave a scene earlier. I
Hmm.
think is a rule that I learned for a thriller, which really helped me. I think in another kind of epic space opera, you want that room and space because it's part of the experience, right?
Yeah.
You want the setup. You want a kind of a sense of an arc and closure. You need a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter, right? So that the person just has to turn the page. You stop it at a point where you're not through with everything, right? That you leave it. um, Same thing with character development. I had to really move more towards show rather than tell. and be really mindful of making sure I was showing as much as possible and not telling. And I also had to make some sacrifices, like I love world building, but I had to catch myself. Like there were times when I was like, "Ooh, I want to talk about this wine, this Gondot, for like a paragraph," because I got all these cool ideas, and
Yeah.
my thriller writer back here is like, "Yeah, but you can't do that because you got to
Yeah.
keep things moving." And so it was a lot about thinking about efficient economy of words. I would say
Hmm.
economy of words. Um, Being really making sure every word was something that needed to be there, every description was something that needed to be there, and then exiting a scene earlier, entering a scene later, I think was really helpful.
Hmm. And then building on that sort of character development thing, what about building on um the importance of things like relationships and family? You mentioned
Mm.
earlier the inspiration for Kissy. But
Yeah.
how did you go about balancing that for me, which for me is a really core relationship
Yeah.
throughout this whole book?
I don't know, Adrian. On this one, I'm just going to go with like I don't know. That kind of felt very natural to me. I think as a writer.
Stellar
Um,
instinct, perhaps?
Yeah. No, but I mean, seriously, I think, that's something that I feel like I'm very comfortable as a writer doing. I
Yeah.
think if I think back on my other books, I think like, Jotty and Ilo, there's a lot of people who have these kind of mentorship or older and younger relationships.
Yeah.
And that just kind of came naturally um, to me. And I liked the tension of having the grandmother be a former agent and the way in which you're always kind of walking in the shadow of a legend. um, that was really really nice to do, but yeah, I don't know about balancing that. I think it just kind of happened.
Comes naturally to
Yeah, I don't
me.
I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's all good, buddy. What are some other challenges that arose? Because you are playing in an entirely new
Yeah.
fictional playground. But also at the same time, what were some fun opportunities that you had
Hmm.
for? You've mentioned some ways in which you improved. Like really like crash course and thrillers.
Yeah.
What were some other fun opportunities that allowed you to improve as a writer?
um, well, I would say the red herring, thinking about a red herring, right, and trying to I had to work backwards too, and I'm glad I got that lesson. I listened to a lot of other people who write thrillers and their advice, and I worked backwards. And I think it was a lot of fun to play around with misdirection, and that was really it was difficult to do because I constantly had to. You have to kind of constantly go back and check and make sure you're leaving enough information, right, for the plot line to work, but you've got to have the things that you need to have happening, but you
Yeah.
have to keep the attention on something else. And that was really crafty, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun. It was kind of like, you're the author going like like, you're literally scheming in a way, because you're like, I know what's going on the side. Um, and everyone figures it out at different points too.
Hmm.
And there's no I learned there's no right or wrong to that. Like, some people get it early and some people get it later and some people find it out right at the point where it's the reveal, and that's all good. I will say that the second person um, was kind of fun to play around with, as a kind of an interesting tool to kind of shift people from the virtual out of the physical to the virtual.
Hmm.
That was fun.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that choice because it's like um there's an immersive factor to second person, which is
Yeah.
very difficult to pull off just as a tense in general. But I think it's cool that you used it like in terms of the immersion of virtual reality conjoined with the immersion of
Yeah.
second person was really cool.
Yeah, I mean that was partly because I mean a lot of gaming, right? A lot of games are written in second person, right? Like
Hmm.
tabletop role play games and things like that because of the immersion. And I thought this is a great opportunity. I had written something in second person, a short story actually that was the first short story I wrote actually that got published was in second person. I like second person. but I know it's like not everybody's cup of tea. And I
Hmm.
know that when people read this book, for it's going to land for some people, and some people are just not going to like it. Um, but the nice thing about it here was I had thought about the way in which it could be used so you're entering that other space, but it was the pronouns that was the difficult decision because
Yeah.
logically, if you're going to use the characters who are entering those spaces, you would be using like he or she or they. But what I found was when I used she, for example, for Laline, it pulled the reader farther out of the story. And what I wanted to do was I wanted the reader to feel, like you said, immersed. I wanted immersion. And
Yeah.
so I made the choice to use the you so that, you can easily put someone in someone's head and their mind, right, in third person. You can use inner monologue, and you
Hmm.
can you can put the reader in the character's head really easily, but you can't put them in their body as well as you can with second, I don't think. And so that's
Exactly.
why I wanted to use second, because it's like I want you to be, it's like the Matrix. I want you to be Neo in this like white thing, right? And it's like I want to tell it as if you're in the body of this character. And so that's where the second person came in.
Yeah, I like that, man. Well, looking ahead to the future, I know you've told me before about how kind of how your writing process has developed, and it's like you kind of use it in tandem with how your teaching schedule progresses over the course of a
Yeah,
year.
it's true.
Um, so, what kind of stuff do you have in the works, or what kind of ideas are churning in terms of like the
Yeah.
year ahead and what you want to work on next?
Yeah. So I think I'm like a one book a year person. And I think it's like in my winter break is my plotting and planning, and then
Yeah.
my early working in the spring a little bit, and then my summer is when I really like bang out the writing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't really know right now. I'm kind of in a weird space where I'm feeling a little pulled between going back to a more epic, kind of something that has a more epic feel, or
Hmm.
continuing on a more thriller, economic kind of, faster paced work. But I'm very interested in space fantasy right now.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of maybe a space fantasy. So maybe leaning a little bit more into something to do with magic, but in a space context.
Awesome. And do you think you'll return to the world of Stellar Instinct in the future?
You know, I would like to. I would really like to. I think it would be fun to go back. I think there's some more things to do there, and I think it would be a blast to do it.
Yeah, and you got some awesome characters to work with, a really
Yeah,
cool, yeah, like,
yeah,
aliens and different planets and all this kind of stuff. It's
yeah. I
ripe.
mean, that's the other thing about a galactic setting too, right? There's endless places to explore, right?
Yeah, man. Awesome. Well, to close out, if you could share with viewers and listeners what you're currently reading or watching or listening to, anything that you
Oh
are
yeah, yeah.
enjoying that you want to share with them.
Yeah. So, oh, let's see. Well, let's see. I just finished, as you know, watching Andor, which
Mhm.
was absolutely amazing, and I absolutely loved it. And I am reading right now. Actually, I'm reading the last book in Tom Bruno's series, the Kamara series, in on
Nice.
the Threshold of the Universe,
Mhm.
and finishing that up. I'm super excited to read The Immortality Thief by Taryn Hunt,
Ooh.
which is a book that I'm really, really interested in reading. So that's what I have my eyes set on for the near future. And I read a nice thriller actually too by Amakatsu called Red Widow, which was a slow burn, kind of a interesting slow burn thriller about sort of U.S. Russia relations, which was really interesting.
Ooh, fantastic.
Yeah.
What's the Immortality Thief about?
I don't even know too much about it. I just know that I think it's a ship on its way somewhere that's going to encounter some kind of a crisis.
Mhm.
But it looks super interesting. So I just snatched it the other day down. And it's on my list of upcoming things to read.
Excellent, man. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today, my friend. I really appreciate it. I highly recommend everyone go check out Stellar Instinct and the Wind Tide Trilogy. Also, you can hear Jonathan on episode 13 on space opera and episode 30 on heists and capers and SFF. And Jonathan, if you could tell listeners and viewers where they can find you on social media.
Sure. I am at J Nevair pretty much everywhere. So you can find me on Twitter if it's still alive. You can find me on Hive Social and Instagram and Facebook, all with that handle.
Awesome, buddy. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.